The air in the small Colorado town feels different in late autumn, thinner somehow, as if the mountains themselves are exhaling a long-forgotten memory. A man named Daniel Moore stands inside his father's old cabin, surrounded by the quiet clutter of a life that has already ended. Dust floats like ash through the amber light of late afternoon. He came here to clean, to sort through what remains of a man who once spent decades chasing ghosts in these woods. What he doesn't expect to find is the thing that will undo everything he thought he knew about his father, about 1986, about 5 friends who never came home, and about a map that should not exist. He opens an old wooden trunk buried beneath boxes of faded Polaroids and water-stained journals. The smell of damp paper fills the room, the scent of things too long forgotten. Inside, rolled tightly and bound with an elastic band gone brittle with age, is a hiking map. Daniel unrolls it carefully across the table. The paper crackles like old bones. It's marked with trails and elevation lines, hand-drawn annotations in faded pencil. But what arrests him are the 5 names written along a route that cuts deep into the San Juan Mountains. Names he's never seen before, but that his father once whispered about when he thought Daniel wasn't listening. The year 1986 is scribbled in the corner, half smudged but unmistakable, and beneath it, a faint reddish stain that looks like rust, or maybe something else. One section of the map is darker, the paper water damaged and torn at the edges. A circle marks a spot labeled simply, Camp 2, Shortcut Trail. Daniel frowns. He checks the legend, the coordinates, the nearby landmarks. There's no shortcut trail on any official map of Colorado, not now, not ever. He turns the map over and finds something written in the margin. The handwriting isn't his father's. The ink is newer, too dark, too fresh to have been written nearly 40 years ago. It reads, "They didn't all die out there." The words seem to hum with a quiet menace, the kind that makes the air feel heavier around you. Daniel's pulse quickens. He remembers his father's late-night murmurs, the way he'd sit at the same table, tracing invisible lines on the wood, whispering about 5 gone and 1 who stayed. Outside, the wind rises. Pine branches scrape against the window like fingernails. He looks again at the names, Mark, Julia, Eric, Tom, and someone whose name is nearly erased. Only the first letter remains. L. Daniel doesn't know it yet, but that single letter will haunt him more than any ghost could. He flips through his father's old journals piled nearby. There are pages filled with desperate scrawl, coordinates, weather reports, missing persons articles, all orbiting around one single obsession. The 1986 hiking trip. The story had been told and retold in this town for decades. 5 friends set out on a summer hike into the Rockies, never returned, and were never found. The search lasted months. The grief lasted years. It was one of those tragedies that never quite left the soil. Daniel's father, a local at the time, had been among the search volunteers. But what no one knew was that he never really stopped searching. Even as the years passed and the story faded from newspaper columns to whispered folklore, the old man kept going back. Every summer, alone, into mountains that had swallowed 5 young lives. Now, standing over that table, Daniel feels the weight of his father's silence settle over him like snowfall. This map, this impossible relic, is not just a remnant of obsession. It's a message in the past that refuses to stay buried. He traces a route with his finger, the pencil line still rough beneath the skin. Somewhere deep in that wilderness lies the truth his father could never reach, and perhaps never wanted him to. The map is more than paper. It is a wound reopening. A part of him wants to burn it, to erase whatever ghost it carries. But another part, the part that sounds too much like his father's voice, whispers that the story isn't finished, that there's something waiting at the end of that marked trail. He folds the map carefully, places it in his jacket pocket, and looks out to the cabin window, at the fading light beyond the tree line. The sun dips behind the peaks, and the forest darkens as if drawing breath. The story of the 5 friends is about to be told again, only this time to the eyes of the son who inherited the map and the curse it carries. Somewhere outside, the mountains are watching, waiting for someone to remember. Summer of 1986 in Colorado was the kind of season that seemed to hum with life. The air was dry but electric. The light stretched long into the evenings, and everything smelled faintly of pine sap and gasoline. It was a year before the world started feeling smaller. No cell phones, no GPS, no internet. Just paper maps, cassette tapes, and promises that felt like forever. In the mountain town of Silver Ridge, 5 friends were about to begin the last adventure of their lives. They were all 20-something, teetering between youth and the gravity of adulthood, that fragile space where everything still feels infinite. Mark Rivers was the one who planned the trip. Tall, charismatic, a natural leader with a streak of recklessness that both inspired and terrified his friends. He was the kind who spoke of the wilderness as if it were alive, something to be conquered and understood at the same time. He'd spent the spring saving up for new gear, marking routes on a map. He swore no one else had hiked before. Julia Kent was his girlfriend, or maybe his ex, depending on which of the others you asked. She was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who noticed the world in fragments. The sound of rain on tin, the way sunlight fractured through branches. Her camera was her voice. She had taken hundreds of Polaroids that summer. Friends laughing at gas stations, sunsets over empty highways, faces reflected in diner windows. She wanted to make something beautiful before everything fell apart, though she didn't know how close that moment really was. Eric Dalton was a skeptic. He wasn't much of a hiker, but he came because he didn't trust Mark not to get himself killed. He was practical, sarcastic, always the one to ask, "What's the plan if this goes wrong?" He worked part-time at a mechanic's shop, his hands always stained with grease. Beneath the jokes and cynicism, there was loyalty. He'd follow his friends into the dark if they asked, even if he complained the entire way. Then there was Tom Herrera, the peacemaker, the bridge between everyone else's friction. Tom was the kind of person who made everything seem manageable. He'd lost his older brother a few years earlier in a climbing accident, and though he rarely spoke about it, the loss clung to him like shadow. He joined the trip for reasons he couldn't fully explain, maybe to prove that he could face the mountains that had once taken so much from him. The 5th member of the group, the one who would later be little more than a name smudge on a map, was Lewis Finch, or L, as everyone called him. He wasn't part of their original circle. He was a recent transplant, renting a cabin near the trailhead. No one knew much about him, just that he'd hiked alone often, and that Mark had met him a few months earlier while scouting the routes. L had a strange calm about him, a quiet intensity that drew Mark in. He talked about hidden trails and old paths not listed on any modern map. To him, the forest wasn't dangerous. It was sacred. By June, they had their supplies packed. Tents, food rations, a stove, cameras, and a cheap compass Julia bought from a roadside stall. Their plan was simple: to start from Crystal Creek, hike 3 days north, and circle back through what Elle called the Shortcut Trail, a name that didn't appear in any of the park rangers' notes. But to the 5 of them, that mystery was part of the appeal. Before leaving, they spent one last night in town. They gathered at a small diner near the highway, the kind with red leather booths and flickering neon signs. The waitress remembered them later, the laughter, the arguments, the way Julia kept taking pictures of everyone as if afraid she'd forget their faces. Tom had been sketching the mountain outline on a napkin, while Mark explained the route again, confident and restless. Eric rolled his eyes and muttered something about getting lost and making the 6 o'clock news, earning a smirk from Julia. When they left the diner, the sky was streaked with orange and purple. Julia took one last photo of them standing beside Mark's old Chevy, arms around each other, the mountains rising behind like ancient guardians. That photo would become a kind of relic later, the last clear evidence of who they were before the forest erased them. As they drove toward the trailhead, music spilled from the car radio. The Police, Springsteen, Fleetwood Mac. The windows were down, the wind pulling at their hair. They passed through small towns, gas stations, and long stretches of highway, where the world seemed to hold its breath. Every few miles, they'd see signs warning of flash floods, rock slides, bears. They laughed at them all, young enough to think danger was only something that happened to other people. When they finally reached the base of the trail, the evening had settled into a soft indigo glow. The woods stood tall and still, endless rows of pine whispering in the breeze. They pitched camp near the edge of a creek, the air cool and damp. Julia took another Polaroid. Mark lighting the first fire, Eric pretending to toast with a tin mug, Tom smiling in the background. Elle stood apart, half in shadow, staring toward a tree-line, as though listening to something only he could hear. That night, under a sky drenched in stars, they talked about the future. Mark spoke of new climbs and bigger adventures. Julia of moving away to study art. Eric planned to quit his job. Tom wanted to open a small outdoor shop in town, and Elle said only that the world was full of forgotten places. Places that didn't want to be found. His words slipped into the crackle of the fire, unnoticed by the others, but they would echo for years after. In the dark, their laughter carried softly across the valley. The fire burned low, their shadows stretching and twisting against the tents. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a low, uncertain warning swallowed by the mountains. By morning, they would be gone from the world as they knew it, and the photograph Julia took that night would become a window into a vanished summer, the final trace of 5 friends walking willingly into the heart of the unknown. That night, the forest listened, patient and eternal, as if already memorizing their names. Morning came quietly, like the slow inhale before a storm. The forest was drenched in pale gold light, dew clinging to the grass, the smell of pine thick in the air. The 5 friends awoke to a world that felt untouched, suspended in time. Birds called from unseen branches, the creek whispered nearby, and somewhere deep in the woods, a distant echo of wind moved to the peaks like a sigh. This was the beginning, the first true day of their journey. They didn't know it yet, but every step forward would lead them into something far older, far stranger than any of them could have imagined. Mark spread the map on a rock while the others ate breakfast. Instant coffee, dry granola, and laughter that came easily. He traced the route with his finger, eyes gleaming with the thrill of leadership. "We'll follow Crystal Creek north for 8 miles, he said. "Camp near the ridge tonight. From there, we cut east onto the old mining trail." His tone was confident, the same tone he used when convincing people to believe in him. Julia took a photo of the map, the paper wrinkled, the ink faintly smudged from last night's damp air. Elle leaned over Mark's shoulder. "If we take the ridge, we'll lose daylight," he murmured. "There's a shorter path through the East Valley. Locals used it decades ago. It's not on the official maps, but it's there." Mark's expression flickered between intrigue and irritation. He liked being in charge, but something about Elle's quiet certainty disarmed him. Eric scoffed. "Or," he said, "we could just stay on the actual Mark trail like normal human beings." Tom chuckled, trying to diffuse attention. "Let's see how we feel after the first climb." They packed up camp and set out, boots crunching against gravel and wet soil. The first few hours were filled with easy conversation and teasing. Julia stopped every so often to photograph the light breaking through the canopy, the way mist curled around tree trunks like smoke. Mark and Elle walked ahead, their voices low, the others following behind. The forest was stunning. Towering pines, the sharp scent of cedar, and an endless sky so blue it felt like a painting. Yet beneath the beauty, there was a quiet unease, a stillness that didn't quite belong. By noon, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. From there, the landscape stretched wide and endless, mountains folding into each other like sleeping giants. Julia snapped a Polaroid of the view, the photo printing slowly as they stood in silence. "Feels like the edge of the world," Tom said softly. Elle only smiled. Edges aren't always where you think they are. They descended into the valley, the path growing narrower and rougher. The laughter faded as fatigue set in. Their backpacks felt heavier, the sun harsher. Eric began muttering about poor planning, about how the map was wrong. Mark shot him a look at that end of the argument. As the trail dipped toward a bend, they stumbled upon something unexpected. A weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree, almost swallowed by bark. The letters were faint, carved decades ago, barely legible. Camp 2, and beneath it, another arrow, almost erased. Shortcut trail. Mark's grin returned. "See? Told you it was real," he said. Looking at Elle, Eric frowned. "That's not even on the ranger maps." Elle crouched beside the sign, touching the carving as if tracing memory. "It's older than the park system. The miners used it, maybe before them. The trappers." Julia took a photo. Later, when the film developed, The words wouldn't appear clearly. The light would warp across the frame, distorting the letters into a blur. They pressed on, following the narrow trail east. The forest grew denser, the canopy closing overhead until the sunlight fractured into thin ribbons. The sound of running water faded, replaced by the steady hush of wind and distant cracking branches. Tom began to feel uneasy. "Feels different here," he said. Elle nodded. "It should. Not many come this way anymore." By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where wildflowers grew in uneven patches among old stones. Julia sat on a boulder, taking photos of the group, their faces damp with sweat, but smiling. The atmosphere felt lighter again for a while. Mark pretended to pose heroically, Eric tossing pine cones at him, laughter echoing into the trees. But beneath it all, something subtle shifted. When Julia looked through the viewfinder, she thought she saw movement in the tree line, a flash of something pale, watching. When she lowered the camera, it was gone. That night, they made camp near the clearing. The air turned cold quickly, the stars emerging in a sharp, brilliant sprawl. Mark pulled out the map again, frowning at it in the firelight. "Tomorrow we'll take this shortcut," he said, tapping the marked circle labeled Camp 2. "If it connects where I think it does, we'll be back 2 days early." Eric shook his head. "You're guessing based on a map you drew yourself. That's not confidence. That's suicide." Mark didn't reply. He stared at the map as if it were whispering back to him. Julia caught Elle watching Mark, an unreadable expression, somewhere between concern and fascination. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she asked him quietly. He looked into the fire. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told her not to. As the others drifted asleep, the forest grew impossibly still. The fire cracked softly, shadows moving like living things across the tents. Elle stayed awake, sitting by the dying embers, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the trees. He could feel it, the weight of the place, the pulse beneath the soil. Somewhere deep in the mountains, something ancient stirred. When morning came, the group would rise, pack their gear, and follow the hidden trail carved long before they were born. They would laugh again, argue again, and believe they were in control. But the forest was already closing around them, erasing their footprints, marking the beginning of a story no one would ever finish telling. The disposable camera clicks for what will be one of the last times in its short life. The sunlight is harsh that morning, washing everything in a golden glare that makes the forest look almost unreal. Julia squints through the viewfinder, trying to focus on her friends standing near an old wooden trail sign. The letters carved into board Red Raven's Peak Trail. Elevation 9,420 feet behind them. The sky is heavy with gathering clouds, the kind that promise rain. Behold something more electric, more alive. Mark raises his arm around Eric's shoulder, grinning. Tom flashes a peace sign. Elle stands slightly apart, not smiling, just watching the camera. The shutter snaps, freezing them in that single, defiant moment. None of them realize they've just captured the last clear image of themselves alive. Julia shakes the photo as it develops, the colors bleeding into shape. The frame is bright, full of laughter, but in the upper corner, the light fractures strangely, like a ripple or a shadow that doesn't belong. She brushes it off, tucks the photo in her jacket pocket, and shoulders her bag. "We should move," Mark says. "If we reach Camp 2 before the storm, we'll be fine." His tone is brisk, confident, but his eyes flick nervously toward the horizon. The clouds are rolling in fast, gray bruises spreading across the blue. They follow the narrow path upward, the trail winding through thick pine groves and rocky ledges slick with moss. The air smells like wet bark and ozone. Every so often, thunder rumbles in the distance, low and far, but coming closer. Julia keeps taking photos as they climb. The forest feels different through her lens, stretched, distorted, almost breathing. She captures Eric pausing to catch his breath, Tom tying his bootlace, Mark studying the map again. Each click of the camera feels like an attempt to anchor time, to prove they were here, alive, real. By mid-afternoon, the light shifts from gold to silver. The forest dims as if someone has drawn a curtain across the sun. "It's getting darker," Tom mutters. "Should we stop?" Mark shakes his head. Not yet. Camp 2's just a few miles. Elle walks silently behind them, eyes scanning the tree line, as though tracing an old memory. Storm's moving faster than you think, he says quietly. But Mark ignores him. He's determined now, driven by something deeper than pride, almost desperation. They reach a narrow pass where the trees part into a rocky slope. Julia stops to take one more photo, the group against the sweeping backdrop of the mountains, the storm clouds boiling above them. But just as she presses a shutter, a cold gust of wind tears through, snapping branches and lifting dust. The photo comes out overexposed, the edges ghostly white. In the image, their faces blur slightly, as if the forest itself refused to hold them clearly. She frowns, but there's no time to examine it. Raindrops begin to fall, slow, fat, deliberate. Within minutes, the drizzle turns to a downpour. The sky collapses into thunder. Water crashes down to the canopy, drumming against leaves and earth. The trail becomes a river of mud. They scramble for cover beneath an overhang, shouting over the storm. We should head back. Eric yells. We can't. Mark shouts back. We're too far. Camp 2's ahead. Julia wipes rain from her eyes. We don't even know if it's still there. But Mark's already moving, gripping the map so tightly it tears along the fold. They follow him reluctantly, their figures swallowed by the curtain of rain. The wind howls through the pines, bending branches until they creak like bones. Lightning flashes, forking across the ridge, illuminating their faces in harsh white for an instant. Then darkness again. Julia snaps another photo by reflex. The image that will later be found from that moment shows nothing but blinding light, a smear of motion, and something tall in the background that doesn't look like a tree. By the time they reach what Mark insists is Camp 2, it's almost impossible to see. The rain falls sideways, the ground slippery with runoff. They find a small clearing littered with what might have been remnants of an old campsite, a fire ring, a rusted tin cup, half-buried scraps of tarp. See, Mark says, breathless. We made it. His voice sounds hollow, almost drowned by the wind. Tom drops his pack with a grunt, Eric muttering curses under his breath. Julia takes one last photo, Mark standing over the crumbling fire pit, triumphant, defiant, the storm raging behind him. Later, that photograph will be found in a ranger's lost and found box, water-damaged and half-burned at the edges. Mark's face will be only half visible, the background warped with streaks of white, where lightning struck during exposure. In the far corner, near the edge of the frame, there's a faint outline of someone else, too tall, too far away to be any of the five. Investigators would later call it a trick of light, an illusion caused by movement during the flash. But those who knew the story would swear it looked like a sixth person, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. The rain doesn't let up that night. Their tents flood. Their fire dies before it can catch. They huddle beneath soaked tarps, the sound of water relentless above them. Julia clutches her camera to her chest, praying it doesn't get ruined. Mark sits apart, staring at the torn map, muttering calculations to himself. Elle watches him quietly, unreadable as ever. You're following something that doesn't want to be followed, he says softly. Mark looks up, eyes burning with exhaustion and something like obsession. And what if it's leading me, he replies. That line will be repeated years later by rescuers, by journalists, by anyone who tried to make sense of what happened next. It will become part of the folklore. 5 friends chasing the edge of a storm, a leader chasing a whisper through the trees. Julia's last photograph from that night will capture only a blur of faces, streaks of rain, and the faint outline of firelight. Half the image will be burned black. No one ever figures out how. When dawn comes, the rain has stopped. The forest is quiet again, too quiet. The tents are half collapsed, footprints wash away. Julia's camera lies beside her, damp but intact, the last roll half used. She doesn't know yet that she's already photographed their last sunrise. Somewhere in the distance, the wind moves through the valley, carried with it the softest echo of laughter, faint, unplaceable, as if the forest itself is remembering them before it forgets. The morning after the storm dawned cold and white. A thin fog coiled around pines, ghost-like, dampening every sound. The The forest no longer looked like the one they had entered. The air felt heavy, metallic, as though something had been stripped away during the night. The trail behind them was gone, erased by the rain. Everything looked the same in every direction: trees, moss, and silence. For the first time, Mark didn't speak. They gathered around what was left of their campfire, a circle of mud, ashes turned to sludge. Julia's camera sat beside her, wrapped in her jacket, water still dripping from its seams. She clicked it open to see if it worked, but the mechanism jammed halfway. The last photograph inside, taken during the storm, showed nothing but streaks of gray. She stared at it for a long time before sliding it back into her pack. Eric broke the silence first. "We're lost," he said flatly. "That's what this is." Mark shook his head, staring at the torn map spread on a rock. "We're not lost. We just need to reorient. The storm threw us off. That's all." His voice carried a brittle edge, forced confidence masking panic. Tom looked between them, rubbing his temples. "The creek's gone, Mark. It's just gone. We should have reached the ridge by now." El crouched near the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the tree line. "It's not gone," he said quietly. "It's behind us. We're turned around." He pointed toward what seemed to be a wall of identical trees. "That way leads back." Eric laughed bitterly. "Yeah? Then why does the sun keep rising on the wrong side?" But when he looked up, he realized the light had changed again, muted, pale, without direction. It was impossible to tell east from west. Mark folded the map carefully, though the paper was shredded at the edges. "We keep moving forward," he said, voice low but steady. "We find higher ground, get our bearings." He looked at Julia, who nodded weakly. Tom hesitated but followed. Elle lingered a moment longer, eyes distant, before stepping in line behind them. They walked for hours through a landscape that seemed to rearrange itself. The trees grew denser, the ground softer underfoot. At times, the forest opened suddenly into patches of pale grass and wildflowers that hadn't been there minutes before. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no sign of fire. Julia snapped a few photos, each one stranger than the last. Light bending in unnatural patterns. The same crooked tree appearing in multiple frames, even though they hadn't turned back. By midday, they found a shallow ravine where the soil had collapsed into a muddy slope. Mark decided to climb down, insisting it would lead them toward the creek. Eric argued, shouting over the wind that had begun to rise again. "We don't even know if that's the right direction." Mark didn't listen. He slipped halfway down before Tom reached to grab him. The ground gave way under their weight, sending both tumbling into the ravine. Julia screamed and slid after them, landing hard in the mud. When the world stopped spinning, they realized Tom's leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him. He tried to stand, and collapsed with a cry that tore through the forest. El descended calmly, his expression grim. "It's broken," he said. "He can't walk." Mark cursed, slamming his fist into the dirt. Eric stood above them, pacing at the edge of the drop. "We need to go back," he yelled. "We can't keep wandering deeper." The wind answered him with a hollow moan through the trees. They built a crude shelter out of branches and the torn remains of a tarp. Julia wrapped Tom's leg as best she could, tears stinging her eyes. The cold crept in fast, seeping through their clothes. Mark sat beside the map again, muttering measurements under his breath. Elle watched him silently. Finally he spoke. "You keep looking at that map like it knows where we are." Mark looked up defiant. "It does." "No," Elle said, his voice calm but sharp. "You know what it shows, not what it means." "What's that supposed to mean?" Elle stared at him. "That the trail doesn't end where you think it does." Julia turned away from their argument and pointed her camera toward the fog rolling through the valley. Something flickered inside it. Something tall and moving. She blinked, heart hammering. But when she raised the camera again, there was nothing. Just trees and mist. As night fell, the forest changed once more. The sounds of crickets and distant owls vanished. The silence was too complete, unnatural. The only noise came from the faint crackling of their weak fire and Tom's uneven breathing. Julia sat close to him, her head resting on her knees. Mark stared into the flames, his face hollowed by exhaustion. Eric stayed on watch, holding the useless compass in his hand. The needle no longer moved. Sometime after midnight, the rain returned. Not a downpour this time, but a steady whisper, as if the forest were murmuring to itself. Elle stood outside the shelter, looking up into the canopy. Julia called to him softly. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer at first. Then, almost to himself, he said, "It's remembering." "Remembering what?" she asked, shivering. He looked back at her. "Us." The fire sputtered and died. The darkness pressed closer, the trees swaying like slow, breathing giants. Julia clicked her camera once more, using the flash to cut through the black. For a split second, the world lit up. 5 figures huddled beneath branches, their faces pale, and behind them, just at the edge of the light, a figure-shaped shadow curving along the bark. The flash faded, leaving only the echo of their breaths. When dawn came again, the fog was thicker. The ravine was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar slope. Tom's shelter sat in a different clearing than before, though none of them had moved it. The forest had shifted around them like a living thing. Mark studied the map once more, tracing the faded line towards Shortcut Trail. It felt almost warm beneath his fingers. "We're close," he whispered. "Close to what?" Julia asked. He didn't answer. He just smiled faintly and said, "To the truth." No one noticed that the compass, lying half-buried beside the fire pit, had started to spin again, slowly at first, then faster, until it whirled wildly, as though it were trying to point everywhere at once. By then, the forest had already decided what it would keep and what would let go. The first report came 3 days after the storm. By then, the sky over Silver Ridge had already cleared, leaving behind an eerie calm that made the locals uneasy. The families of the missing hikers gathered at the ranger station, a 1-story wooden building at the edge of town, its windows reflecting the distant shimmer of the peaks. Mark Rivers' mother sat on the front bench, clutching a crumpled napkin with his handwriting on it. "Be back by Monday. Don't worry." The words felt like a cruel joke now. Sheriff Dalton, a man built from the same weather stuff as the mountains, stood before a wall map dotted with pins. 5 young adults, he said to the assembled volunteers, left the Crystal Creek trailhead on June 12th. They were due back the 16th. No contact since. Vehicles still parked at the lot. No signs of a return. His voice was flat, rehearsed. He'd said these words too many times before, but his eyes betrayed the weight of it. The forest didn't often give people back once it took them. By that evening, the first search party went out. Rangers, locals, and volunteers armed with flashlights and radios. They followed the marked trail north toward Raven's Peak, calling the hikers' names into the silence. The forest answered with nothing but the rustle of branches and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. On the first night, they found footprints near the creek, 5 distinct sets leading into the higher ridges. Then the tracks vanished as if swallowed by the earth. The next morning brought more teams, more equipment. Helicopters traced the valleys, their rotors slicing the still air. Dogs barked and sniffed along the ridgelines, pulling handlers through thickets of pine. For a while, there was hope, scattered and fragile, but real. They found the remnants of a campfire, a torn piece of tarp, a dented thermos with TH etched into the metal. Searchers marked it with tape and moved on. But as the days passed, the hope began to shrink, devoured by the scale of the wilderness. By the 5th day, the weather turned again. A thin sleet began to fall, coating everything in glassy frost. Radios crackled with half-sentences lost to static. One team reported strange interference. Compasses spinning aimlessly, GPS signals flickering in and out. "It's elevation," one ranger said. "The minerals in the rock." But the older searchers exchanged wary looks. They'd heard those excuses before. At night, campfires dotted the base of the mountain like watchful eyes. Volunteers sat huddled around them, whispering stories to stay awake. One man claimed he'd heard voices through the wind, faint laughter, maybe an echo. Another swore he'd seen a flash of light deep within the forest. Too far for a flashlight, too slow for lightning. The sheriff dismissed it all as exhaustion, but by the end of the week, he wasn't sleeping much either. Back in town, the families waited. Posters went up across telephone poles, convenience stores, and church doors. Missing 5 hikers, last seen June 12th. Julia's photo from the diner became the image on every flyer, her face half-turned, smiling faintly, unaware that this snapshot would become her memorial. Local news vans arrived, reporters asking the same questions again and again. How does a group just vanish? One anchor asked live on air, without a trace, without a word. Inside the ranger's office, the search maps grew more chaotic each day. Lines and arrows layered over one another, entire sections crossed out in red. It's like they walked off the edge of the world, a volunteer muttered, tracing one of the routes with a shaking hand. Then came the 6th day, when something stranger happened. A ranger named Helen Moore was leading a team along the western slope when her radio began to emit a faint rhythmic clicking, not static, something deliberate. "You hearing this?" she asked over the comms. The others didn't respond. The sound grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat, then stopped altogether. When they checked their location, they realized they'd circled the same grove 3 times without realizing it. Their footprints overlapped perfectly, as though time itself had folded. That night, Helen refused to go back out. She told the sheriff she'd felt something watching them from the trees. "Not a bear," she said. "Not anything I could name." The sheriff didn't press her, but later that evening, he saw her standing outside the station, staring toward the mountains with tears running silently down her face. By the 2nd week, the official search scaled back. Funding was drying up, and the storm season was closing in again. The media attention had faded, replaced by newer tragedies elsewhere. Still, a few stayed behind, those who couldn't accept the idea of never knowing. Among them was Tom Herrera's father, Miguel. He spent every daylight hour combing through the valleys, refusing to give up. He'd been a miner once, used the darkness to the weight of silence. Each evening he returned with new theories. Landslides, hidden caves, even a wrong turn that led them across the state border. The sheriff listened politely, but the exhaustion in his eyes gave him away. As the weeks passed, something unsettling began to happen among the remaining searchers. They started reporting strange dreams, each one describing the same thing. A map, a hand-drawn map with 5 names scrawled in the margin. When the sheriff heard the 5th report, he burned the camp logs that night. "We're done," he said. "We're not bringing the mountain down on ourselves." The search officially ended on July 20th, 1986. The file was labeled Unresolved Disappearance, Ravens Peak Group. No remains, no evidence of struggle, no explanation. Just an empty stretch of forest that seemed to swallow sound and memory alike. But for Silver Ridge, the mystery didn't end. It infected the town like a slow fever. Some claimed to see lights in the hills at night. Others swore they heard laughter when the wind blew from the north. Parents warned their children to stay away from the old trails, especially the one no one could ever find on a map, the shortcut that led nowhere. Years later, people still spoke of that summer in hushed tones. They said the forest never gave them back because it didn't lose them. It kept them, like something precious, something it couldn't bear to release. And under the weight of the mountains, the story sank deeper into legend. 5 young friends who vanished into the storm, leaving behind nothing but questions and a silence that still lingers when the wind moves through the pines. Miguel Herrera stopped counting the days after the 2nd month. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. When the sheriff called off the official search in late July of 1986, Miguel refused to accept the verdict. He was the last one still driving up to the trailhead each morning. The same pickup truck rattling up the dirt road, the same thermos of black coffee cooling untouched on the dashboard. His son Tom was still out there. He could feel it. Every morning he parked by the ranger gate, stepped out, and stared toward the mountains as if expecting them to speak. Sometimes he thought they did. He'd grown up in those ranges, mining silver from their bellies, learning their moods. The forest wasn't just trees. It was alive, ancient, listening. He knew the difference between its silence and its warning. What haunted him was that this time, the silence felt personal. He started keeping a notebook, search log, private. Inside, The pages were filled with sketches, coordinates, weather notes, and names of volunteers who'd once joined him before giving up. The first pages were organized, rational. The later ones were feverish, desperate. Phrases like light in the eastern valley again, heard voices near ridge after midnight. Map keeps changing. His handwriting deteriorated with every entry. In early August, Miguel returned to the clearing where the first set of footprints had been found. It looked different now, overgrown, unnatural for the season. He marked the trees with red paint so he wouldn't lose his way, but the marks never seemed to stay where he left them. Some mornings, they were gone entirely, as if the forest had healed itself overnight. He tried everything, consulting retired rangers, native trackers, even a geologist from Denver who laughed when Miguel spoke of magnetic interference. "It's the altitude," the man said, "plays tricks on your brain." Miguel didn't argue. He just looked out toward the peaks and muttered, "It's not the altitude that's doing the trick." By September, his wife had stopped waiting for him to come home before dark. Their kitchen table had become a mess of maps, Polaroids, and newspaper clippings. Julia's final photographs, the ones found in her backpack weeks later near the old mining site, were spread across the surface like relics. Miguel studied them each night under a single lamp. The faces stared back, frozen in laughter, unaware that they were already ghosts. But it wasn't the faces that unsettled him. It was the landscape behind them, trees bending at wrong angles, shadows where no light source existed, a figure in the distance caught in 3 separate frames. He began to dream of the forest, always the same dream. He's standing at the base of the trail, his son calling from somewhere unseen. "Dad," the voice says, "we're right here." But when Miguel runs toward it, the trees close in like a fist. He wakes drenched in sweat, his throat raw from calling a name no one answers. By the end of the year, his marriage had collapsed under the weight of his obsession. His wife left quietly, leaving only a note. "You're searching for the dead, but you're the one disappearing." Miguel didn't blame her. He barely read the note before folding it into the back of his notebook. The next morning, he was already back on the mountain. Winter buried the search sites under snow. Still, he climbed. The cold turned his breath into clouds, the wind carving lines into his face. Some nights he camped alone under the trees, the sound of branches creaking overhead. Once, he swore he saw a light moving between the trunks, soft and deliberate like lanterns. He shouted into the darkness, thinking it was rescuers. No one answered. The lights blinked out, one by one, leaving only the hiss of the wind. He began collecting stories from locals who'd seen strange things. One old trapper swore he'd found a scrap of tent fabric near a frozen stream, torn but clean, as though freshly cut. A hunter claimed he'd heard voices singing faintly through the trees, the melody bending in and out of rhythm. "Did you follow it?" Miguel asked. The hunter just shook his head. Didn't feel like something you follow. By spring, Miguel's notebook had become an artifact of its own. Mud-stained, swollen with weather, the ink blurred in places. He no longer wrote incomplete sentences, just fragments, symbols, sketches of trails that didn't exist on any ranger chart. He spoke less, too. People in town began to avoid him. They said he talked to himself, asked directions to places no one had heard of. Children whispered that the map man lived half in the mountains now, his body still in Silver Ridge, but his soul wandered in the forest. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, Miguel held a small vigil at the trailhead. No reporters came. No officials. Just him and a few flickering candles on the hood of his truck. He whispered each of their names, Mark, Julia, Eric, Tom, Lewis, like a prayer or a curse. The mountains swallowed the sound. That night, he stayed longer than usual. The sky was moonless, the stars sharp and cold. Around midnight, he heard it again, a faint voice carried on the wind. "Dad." It was distant, almost too soft to believe, but unmistakably his son's. Miguel froze, his breath catching. He turned toward the sound, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Tom," he called. The voice came again, closer this time. "Here." He ran into the trees, calling, stumbling over roots and stones. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark in thin slices. "Tom!" he yelled again. No answer. Only the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. Then the light flickered. For an instant, he saw it, something pale between the trees, a figure half hidden, watching him. When he blinked, it was gone. By morning, the search team found his truck still idling by the trailhead, headlights burning into the fog. The passenger seat held his open notebook, a thermos of cold coffee, and a map, creased, mud-stained, with one new line drawn in pencil, leading deeper into the range. On the bottom corner, written in Miguel's rough hand, were 3 words: "Found their trail." He was never seen again. In the years that followed, hikers occasionally stumbled across remnants: an old compass wedged in a stump, a torn jacket sleeve, a notebook page plastered by rain to a tree. The handwriting faded almost to nothing, but one line was still legible: "They're not lost. They're waiting." The town stopped talking about Miguel Herrera the way they stopped talking about the 5 friends. The mountain took them all, and in Silver Ridge, silence became its own kind of respect. But every now and then, when the wind shifts just right, someone swears they can hear it. The faint echo of a man calling for his son, his voice carried endlessly between the pines. It began as whispers, the kind that settle into a town like fog, slow, creeping, shapeless at first. Silver Ridge had lived with silence for so long after the 5 vanished that any new sound, any new rumor, felt electric. By the late 80s, the story had already started bending, reshaping itself to fit the imagination of whoever told it. Every diner waitress, park ranger, and bar regular had their own version of what happened up there. Some said the group stumbled into an abandoned mine shaft, the kind that littered the Rockies like forgotten wounds, and the earth simply swallowed them whole. Others claimed a flash flood wiped them off the ridge and buried them under decades of rock. But then there were the darker stories, the ones people only told when the lights were low and the whiskey was strong, the ones about something else living in those woods. They called it the Pines Man. Some said it was a hermit who'd gone mad decades earlier, a prospector who'd lost everything and refused to leave. Others believed it was older, a presence tied to the forest itself, something that marked those mountains long before any of them were born. It was said to lure travelers deeper with sounds that mimicked voices they trusted, laughter, footsteps, even a loved one calling their name. People swore that once you heard it, you never came back the same. The sheriff dismissed it all as folklore. "People can't handle the idea of nothing," he told a local reporter once. "So they make something out of it." Still, even he couldn't explain the things that followed. The missing posters would sometimes vanish from bulletin boards overnight. Every one of them gone, only to reappear days later, repinned in perfect symmetry. On foggy mornings, hikers reported hearing 5 distinct voices echoing faintly through the valley, calling for help. Rangers who followed the sound never found anything. By 1990, the disappearance had become the town's defining myth. Teenagers dared each other to drive up to the trailhead at night, park their cars, and turn off the headlights. They said if you sat in silence long enough, you'd hear the camera click, the echo of Julia's Polaroid, snapping one last photo. Some claimed to have found Polaroids scattered near the entrance, blank at first glance but slowly developing faint outlines. Trees, faces, a smear of light. No one could ever prove it. For the older generation, the tragedy turned to superstition. The forest was no longer a place to hike or hunt. It was a place to avoid. "That trail doesn't want you there," one of the old miners used to say. The mountain keeps what it needs. On anniversaries, small memorials would appear near the ranger station, rocks stacked in strange shapes, flowers left without notes. No one ever saw who placed them. But the strangest rumor started after Miguel Herrera vanished. His truck was found idling by the road, his maps and notes laid out like an unfinished offering. People began claiming to see him, or something wearing his shape. Hikers described a man walking just ahead of them on the trail, his clothes soaked, his gait slow but purposeful. When they called out, he never turned around. He simply walked into the trees and disappeared. Others spoke of hearing him on the wind, repeating the same words. Found their trail. For the families who remained, it was both comfort and curse, a sign that the search never ended, That grief had become eternal. In the early 2000s, an amateur paranormal group visited Silver Ridge, chasing the legend for their web series. They interviewed locals, recorded EVPs, camped near the old trailhead. On their second night, their equipment malfunctioned, batteries drained, compasses spun wild. One of the cameras captured a faint voice saying, "Don't follow." The audio tech swore he hadn't heard it until playback. The footage went viral briefly before being pulled offline by the uploader, who later deleted their entire channel. The following winter, hikers discovered a wooden sign newly nailed to a tree halfway up the ridge. It wasn't official, hand-carved, crudely shaped, the letters uneven. It read, "Shortcut Trail, Camp 2. Rangers removed it within days, but by the next week, it was back again, nailed to a different tree. The third time it appeared, they stopped touching it. Folklore gave the town something to hold on to, a story to feed the emptiness. But beneath it, a quieter fear grew, that maybe the forest wasn't haunted at all. Maybe it was something else, something sentient, choosing what to return and what to keep. Some of the younger residents tried to rationalize it through science. They talked about infrasound, magnetic anomalies, psychological breakdowns caused by isolation. But even they couldn't explain the reports of hikers finding identical symbols carved into trees miles apart, circles intersected by 5 lines, always 5. And then came the rumor that rekindled everything. It began as a single sentence overheard in a bar near the highway. Someone seen the map again. The voice belonged to a retired ranger named Helen Moore, the same woman who'd heard rhythmic clicking on her radio decades earlier. She told the bartender, "It's back. I saw it with my own eyes." When pressed, she wouldn't say where, only that it wasn't in the ranger archives and it wasn't old. The story spread through town like wildfire. By the end of the week, people claimed to know someone who'd seen it. A map folded neatly inside a library return bin, another spotted in a thrift shop's donation box, a copy mailed anonymously to a Denver newspaper. Each version described the same thing, a weathered hiking map marked 1986, with 5 names written beside a trail that shouldn't exist. No one ever produced physical proof, of course, but that didn't matter. The story had been reborn. Soon, Silver Ridge became a place of pilgrimage for the curious. True crime enthusiasts, ghost hunters, wanderers, all came searching for fragments of mystery that refused to rest. The locals watched them with pity, shaking their heads as the outsiders hiked into the woods with cameras and bravado, only to return pale and shaken, swearing they'd heard voices in the fog. And yet, for all the retellings, one question lingered in every version. What if the map wasn't lost? What if it was waiting, just like they were? Because in Silver Ridge, people no longer spoke of closure. They spoke of cycles, of echoes, of the way the forest seemed to remember its stories better than the people who told them. Some nights, when the mist rolls in from a valley and the wind passes through the aspens, locals say they can see faint lights moving through the trees, 5 of them, in a slow line, following a trail no one can find in daylight. And if you listen closely, you might hear the soft sound of a Polaroid camera clicking in the dark, capturing one more moment that the forest will never let go. The map had been sitting in the corner of Daniel Moore's garage for 3 weeks before he finally unfolded again. He'd tried not to think about it after finding it among his father's things, tried to believe it was just another relic from a man who'd spent too long chasing ghosts. But every time he walked past that old trunk, he could feel it calling to him, like something inside wanted to be seen. The paper had stiffened even more since the day he'd unrolled it. The creases were deep, the ink faded in some places and disturbingly fresh in others. His father's handwriting was clear, neat, deliberate, the same block letters he remembered from his childhood, but scattered across the margins were markings that didn't belong. The newer ink was darker, its lines more urgent, almost carved into the paper instead of written. Daniel spread it across the workbench and stared at it under the dim light of the single bulb. The original trail lines were familiar. He'd traced them 100 times in his father's notebooks. But someone had added new coordinates, drawn fresh boundaries. The words "shortcut trail" were circled twice in red ink, and beside them, a message written in slanted script that made his stomach turn. They didn't all die out there. He felt a chill crawl up his arms. His father had been the last known person to search those mountains obsessively, year after year, even after the official search ended. Daniel remembered the arguments, the late nights, the smell of dirt and pine clinging to his father's clothes. He'd always thought it was grief that kept the old man going. Now, staring at the map, he wondered if it had been something else. Belief? He took a photograph of the map on his phone and sent it to a friend of his from college, a cartographer named Elise who worked with old survey data. Her reply came a few hours later. That trail doesn't exist. Not now. Not in any geological records. Where did you get this? He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked, could it have existed once? Her reply took longer this time. Maybe. There are old logging routes that vanished when the forest regrew, but the coordinates you sent don't match any known terrain. It's like the topography's wrong. Wrong. That word echoed in his mind for the rest of the night. By the next morning, Daniel couldn't stop himself. He cleared his schedule, packed a bag, and drove up towards Silver Ridge, the same route his father had taken for decades. The mountains loomed in the distance, blue-gray against the horizon, their peaks wreathed in mist. It had been years since he'd last been there, and yet it all looked eerily unchanged. The diner still sat at the crossroads, the same hand-painted sign swinging in the wind, the same empty look from locals when they noticed his last name. At the ranger station, the clerk froze when he handed her a copy of the map. Her expression changed. First confusion, then something like fear. Where did you get this? She asked. It was my father's, Daniel said. Miguel Moore. He volunteered in the searchback in '86. She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. We've seen this map before. What do you mean? Her voice dropped. It's been turning up every few years. Always the same markings. Different paper. Same ink. People bring it in. Say they found it in mailboxes, in thrift stores, in old books. We stopped logging the reports a decade ago. Daniel stared at her. But how? Some things don't stop just because we stopped looking, she interrupted, her eyes flicking to the window, to the line of trees outside. If I were you, I'd leave it alone. He drove to the trailhead anyway. The lot was nearly empty except for a single pickup truck and a rusted Ranger vehicle. The air was thin, sharp with altitude. He pulled the map out again, holding it against the steering wheel. The ink seemed darker in the daylight. He ran his fingers over the lines, feeling the raised impressions as if whoever had drawn them pressed too hard, carving into the paper itself. It was irrational, but he could almost feel his father's presence there. Not comforting, watchful. He thought of the nights he'd found the old man sitting at the kitchen table, tracing invisible routes with his finger across the wood grain, whispering coordinates under his breath. He'd thought it was madness. Now it felt like inheritance. He followed the trail as best he could. The first few miles were familiar. Gentle slopes, wide paths, the scent of pine needles crushed underfoot. But soon, the terrain began to shift subtly. Trees grew denser, their trunks thicker, the air colder even though it was midday. The sun struggled to break through the canopy. The world felt muted, as if sound itself was being swallowed. He stopped near a clearing and checked the map. Something didn't line up. The topography should have led him toward the creek. But instead, the land dipped into a shallow valley that wasn't marked anywhere on paper. He frowned and pulled out his phone, but the GPS showed nothing. No coordinates, no elevation. Just a blinking cursor, suspended in gray. Dad, he whispered to himself. What the hell were you chasing? He turned the map over and noticed, for the first time, faint smudges beneath the surface. Something written in pencil, erased but not completely gone. He held up to the light and read, If the trail moves, follow the trees. He felt the breath leave his lungs. The forest around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows longer. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. That's when he noticed it. Small carvings on several trunks, barely visible beneath the moss. Circles intersected by 5 lines. The same symbols from the rumors. The same ones his father had sketched in the margins of his notebook before disappearing. He should have turned back right then. He knew it, but something deeper, something that felt almost like memory, pulled him onward The deeper he went, the stranger the world became. The forest no longer seemed random. It felt structured, deliberate. The trees were spaced too evenly, their shapes too symmetrical. At times, he could swear he was walking in circles, yet the landmarks kept changing. A stream where there hadn't been one, a ridge that vanished when he turned around. He found remnants along the way, small things left behind like breadcrumbs. A torn strap, a rusted camp stove, the corner of an old Polaroid showing nothing but blur. And then, near dusk, he stumbled upon something that stopped him cold, a tree with a carving in its bark. Not a symbol this time. Words. 5 names, barely legible but still there. Mark, Julia, Eric, Tom, and L. The last letter was carved deeper, almost gouged into the wood, as if someone had tried to erase it and failed. The bark around it was darker, as though burned. Daniel reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, the air around him shifted. The forest grew silent again, not peaceful, but heavy, waiting. He stepped back, his pulse hammering. The map slipped from his hand, landing face down on the damp ground. When he picked it up, it wasn't the same. The lines had changed. The route twisted differently now, leading not north toward Raven's Peak, but east, straight into an area marked only with faint circle and 2 words written in his father's unmistakable handwriting. The cabin. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, staring at those words. He didn't remember his father ever mentioning a cabin, but something inside him, the same pull that brought him here, told him he had to find it. He folded the map carefully, tucked it into his jacket, and looked toward the direction the new line pointed. The sun was setting, the forest awash in amber light that felt more like warning than beauty. Whatever was waiting there wasn't new. It had been waiting a very long time. The trees thinned as Daniel climbed. The late afternoon sun bled to the pines in streaks of gold, but the light felt wrong, too heavy, too slow, as though it were moving through syrup instead of air. His breath came in sharp bursts. The altitude wasn't what made him dizzy. It was a sensation that the mountain itself was alive beneath his boots. Every few steps, he'd hear faint cracking sounds in the distance, branches breaking, something shifting in rhythm with him, stopping whenever he did. He followed the map's new line eastward until the ground began to slope downward again, into a basin where the trees were paler, almost white. Their bark peeled in strips that fluttered like paper. Aspens. He'd reached a grove that locals called the Whispering Forest, though he didn't yet know why. The air here was different, thin, colder than elevation should allow. The wind didn't howl. It murmured. It sounded eerily like voices speaking beneath their breath, just out of reach of understanding. Daniel stopped to catch his breath. The forest floor was littered with bones of fallen branches, and the soil underfoot was soft and damp. The light had begun to fade, but ahead, through the trunks, he saw it. A small dark shape nestled in the distance. A structure. His pulse quickened. The cabin. It was exactly where the map said it would be, an impossibility that made his stomach twist. The building leaned slightly to one side, half swallowed by the earth and overgrown with vines. Its roof sagged inward, and one window was shattered, but the walls were still intact. Someone at some point had lived here. He stepped closer, the crunch of leaves loud in the suffocating quiet. A set of old footprints marked the ground leading up to the porch, barely visible, almost erased by time. They didn't look decades old. He crouched down, tracing one with his finger. The print was shallow, edges crisp, recent. The door creaked open with sound like something exhaling. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke. The smell was thick, mold, wetwood, and something faintly metallic. The interior was small. One room, a broken table, the remains of fireplace, and a cot covered in rags. A faint trail of ash lined the hearth, as if a fire had burned there not long ago. Daniel's flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the walls. They were covered in markings, dozens of them, circles intersected by 5 lines, over and over, carved deep into the wood. Beneath some of them, words appeared, written in faded ink. Camp 2 shortcut trail. Follow the pines. His breath hitched when the beam landed on one marking near the window. It wasn't just a word this time. It was a date. June 16, 1986. His hand tightened around the flashlight. That was the day they disappeared. He turned slowly, the air suddenly colder. On the far wall hung something he hadn't noticed before, a small, cracked mirror nailed to the wood. Beneath it, resting on a shelf, lay a Polaroid camera. The same model Julia Kent had used that summer. His heart stuttered. He reached out, fingers brushing the plastic. It was cold, but not dusty. Someone had touched it recently. He lifted it carefully, and the moment he did, a faint sound echoed from outside. A click, then another, the unmistakable mechanical snap of a Polaroid shutter. Daniel froze. He turned toward the door, every instinct screaming. The forest beyond the cabin was pale with twilight. The sound came again, closer this time. He stepped out onto the porch, scanning the trees. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Who's there?" No answer, only the low whisper wind through the aspens, their leaves trembling like thin hands. He raised his flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the grove, and then he saw it. Something hung from one of the trees. A photograph, pinned to the bark by a small nail. He walked closer, each step crunching in the silence. The photo swayed gently in the wind. It was a Polaroid, edges new, glossy. He turned the beam toward it and felt his chest seize. The image showed this cabin, exactly as it looked now. And standing on the porch, illuminated by his own flashlight, was him. Daniel stumbled back, heart pounding. The photo slipped from his fingers and fell into the dirt. He shone the light toward the tree line, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of white bark, shadows weaving between the trunks like smoke. He turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut. His hands shook as he set the camera down on the table. It clicked once on its own, ejecting another photograph. He stared at it, afraid to look but unable to stop himself. The image developed slowly. Shapes bled into view, the cabin again, this time from inside. And in the corner of the picture, a faint silhouette. Someone standing behind him. Daniel spun around. Nothing. Just empty air, empty shadows. His breathing grew ragged. He picked up the map again, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But now the ink looked different. The lines darker, the handwriting no longer his father's. A new message had appeared across the bottom margin. "You've finally made it." The flashlight flickered. The cabin groaned under a sudden gust of wind. Something in the distance snapped. A tree branch, maybe, or something else moving. He tried to tell himself it was the altitude, the isolation, the tricks of exhaustion. But then the air shifted again, colder, sharper, filled with a faint scent of smoke. He turned toward the fireplace. The ashes inside were glowing faintly red. His pulse roared in his ears. He backed away slowly, eyes locked on the embers that shouldn't exist. They pulsed once, twice, and then the faintest whisper drifted from them. 5 voices, overlapping, soft as breath. "Stay with us." The camera clicked again. He bolted out the door, stumbling through the aspens, the cold slicing into his lungs. The light faded fast, the forest turning silver and black. He didn't know where he was running, only that he had to get away from the cabin, from the voice, from the map that seemed to rewrite itself in his hands. He didn't notice until he reached the clearing that he'd dropped the map behind him. It lay on the cabin floor, half covered in dust, one corner catching the faint firelight from a hearth. The lines on it shifted one last time, curling into new shapes. When they settled, the trail no longer led to cabin. It stopped abruptly at the clearing's edge, beside a single word written in neat, steady handwriting. More. The forest grew silent again, the wind dying completely. In the distance, the Polaroid camera clicked once more. The photograph slid out and fluttered to the floor. It showed the empty cabin, the fire dying, and the map, now perfectly clean, its ink fresh, waiting for another hand to unfold it. The sheriff found Daniel's truck at the trailhead, engine cold, door unlocked, map on the passenger seat. It looked almost staged, like the forest had placed it there deliberately. Inside his notebook, a single line was scrawled across the last page. The 5th friend wasn't one of them. At first, everyone thought it was grief, a son lost in his father's obsession. But when investigators reviewed the 1986 photos again, the story began to unravel. In some pictures, there were 5 hikers. In others, only 4. The stranger known as L flickered in and out, sometimes there, sometimes gone. No record of him existed. No ID, no birth certificate, no memory beyond the group's last day alive. Some believed he'd been real, a drifter or a guide. Others whispered he was something older, something the forest used to draw the rest in. Every missing person report since then mentioned the same pattern. 5 sets of footprints leading into the trees for coming out. Years later, the legend hardened into warning. Hikers said if you wandered too far off trail, you might see him. Tall, quiet, his face obscured by shadow. He'd ask if you were lost. If you said yes, he'd smile and point the way. None who followed ever returned. The locals don't speak his name anymore. They just call him the 5th friend. The one who never left. The one who waits where the forest still remembers. When to return to Silver Ridge quiet and endless, covering the trails and cabins like a secret kept too long. The snow fell for days, soft enough to erase footprints but not memory. The ranger station stood empty now. Just a locked door, a corkboard full of old pinholes, and a single Polaroid photo tacked in the center. The image showed the mountains under a full moon and 5 faint silhouettes standing in the trees, their faces turned toward the light. When the spring thaw came, hikers found a map nailed to a tree near Raven's Peak. It was new, paper crisp, ink dark, and in the corner, a single phrase written by hand, "Where the pines remember." No one claimed it. The wind took it by dusk. Each year since, the same thing happens. A map appears, vanishes, then returns again. Always the same markings, always 5 names. The forest breathes, the town endures, and the story begins anew. They say if you listen in the aspen grove on a still night, you can hear the faint click of a camera and laughter fading through the wind. Not ghosts, just echoes. The mountain never forgets. And somewhere in that endless hush, the map unfolds itself once more, waiting for whoever is willing to follow where memory leads.